the raffle at our lightning talks. I think that's all of our announcements for today. If you're online and you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A function instead of the chat. And without further ado, here is our seminar chair, Rowana Rard.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm delighted to present our speaker today. I have your bio right here. Dr. James Raymer is a professor of demography at the Australian National University and a visiting scholar with CSDE. His research focuses on developing innovative methodologies and analytical frameworks to study demographic processes. He is especially interested in understanding migration in situations where data are inadequate or missing, and has engaged in many interdisciplinary and international research collaborations on topics ranging from statistical estimation of migration flows to population estimation and forecasting. So there's a quick introduction, and I'm so pleased to welcome you up here. Take it away.
Thank you, and thank you for coming, both online and in person. It's great to be here at the University of Washington, and really enjoyed my past 3 weeks just spending time on campus and meeting people. So it's been a real pleasure to be here. So thank you. Yeah, so today I'm trying to give an overview of some of the stuff I'm interested in, which is, I've titled it Modeling Migration to Understand Demographic Change. It's stuff, it goes back many years for me, but I'm still very keen on doing this type of research. So give you a bit of motivation. I mean, this is how I look at it anyway, but migration affects all spheres of life, from economic to social to political. From a demographics perspective, populations are living longer, having fewer children, and they're increasingly being altered by both internal and international migration. Having a sense for the numbers of how many people are moving, how many migrants we have, their effects on population change, we need this information to inform policies and eventually create better systems of both migration management, but also support. Okay, and the reality is, I guess with the background to this, and I'll talk a lot about that today, is the reality is we don't have that sense of numbers. That sense of numbers is missing. And moreover, I think one of the key issues that we have when we think about migration is often analyzed kind of in silos from either a single area or a single country perspective, and flows are analyzed separately from stocks. So we're not linking that kind of how populations are being affected by migration, but also how they're producing migrants and the feedback mechanisms that go on. And by looking at migration from like these single perspectives or these silo perspectives, this results in partial understanding. So we're not really understanding the complexity of migration. And it results in inconsistent measurement. So when I do a lot of demographic accounting work, and our flows are measured differently from our populations. And when you put the two together, they don't line up. And we're often wondering what to do then after that. So to me, the solution to all this is to, move away from that silo approach to research and start thinking about systems, either population systems. If we think about data, we can think about data systems and analytical strategies. And fundamental, I think, for analyzing migration are combining and sharing information. Migration is never measured to study migration. It's usually an off product from either administrative activity or it could be from a census or survey, but those have their imperfections. If we're thinking about international migration, migration is from one country to another. Right? So the United States doesn't have any information on people leaving the country. But all the countries that US citizens or US migrants go to potentially have that information because they're receiving them. So if the US government would work with other countries' governments and share information on both who's coming and going, we would have better information on migration. And there are some examples in the world, the Nordic countries in Europe, the way that Sweden knows someone's moved to Norway is Norway tells them, because they enter their population register. They inform the Sweden Statistical Office, that a migrant has arrived. And they have that internal consistency. The other thing, and this comes back to my PhD training many years ago, is when you think about migration, it's not just in migration, out migration, or immigration, emigration. Really, migration is movement from one place to another. So when we're analyzing migration, we should be thinking about in terms of origin, destination, and tables of migration flows. So a lot of my work is focused on trying to come up with those matrices, those origin, destination tables of migration. And lastly, demographic accounting, which is like our fundamental tool for both estimation and projection of populations, but it also allows us to place migration in the context of wider population change, allows us to assess the measurement of migration in relation to other demographic events. So the demographic accounting is really important from my perspective. And so by being able to track populations and their entries and exits over time, we can better understand the effects on demographic change, societal change, what have you, and assess the efficiency of, say, international migration policies. And I'm sorry for those of you who do net migration, but my advice would be avoid net migration at all costs. Okay, it just gets you in trouble every time. I think net migration is unpredictable. Net migration, by the way, is the difference between in and outflows. And it's unexplained because it's this difference. It's not a person, you know, no one's, as Andre Rogers would have said, have you ever met a net migrant? It's a difference in people, so we're not actually counting people, we're counting differences in people. So it's hard to explain the net migration change. Is that because more people have come in or more people have left, or a combination of the two? And then for modeling or for forecasting or anything like that, net migration doesn't exhibit the same regularities. Sometimes you do find some trend lines and stuff, but it doesn't exhibit the same regularities that you see with the flows of inflows and outflows over time across ages and so on. And lastly, this is something I keep arguing for the Australian government, especially, is it's not useful for policy. Here I'm thinking we don't really have policies for well, some countries like China, which we heard about last week, does have like a internal registration system for migrants, but most countries, domestic movements, people are free to move wherever they want. But international migration is controlled via entries, not so much the exits. All right, so really policy should be directed at immigration, not net migration. Okay, so that's my bit of background. I thought I'd just give you one slide on some of the major projects I've had on my modeling migration flows. I'm not going to go through all this, but just to give you a sense of the different types of problems that I've been working on, say, over the past 20 years. But I've looked at internal migration and how we can combine different data sources to better understand the patterns over time. So doing things like combining census data, which is usually measured every 5 or 10 years, with administrative data, so you can get annual flows over time. But you can also, using census or survey data, add details to your estimates. So you can look at how, say, flows by education or flows by economic activity are changing over time. So I had a major project on this in England where we developed some methodologies for combining different types of data. My biggest projects probably to date were and I started off a long time ago on this, but looking at international migration in Europe. And we developed methods for both harmonizing the available data, that means making them consistent, and estimating missing data. So the situation with international migration is every country collects its own data for its own purposes. Okay, and again, it's in that silo approach, which I first mentioned, is rarely ever connected to any kind of migrant stock. Or if you think, well, this just goes on. If you think about the United Nations data that we have on migration, they have this migrant stock database. That's really about foreign-born populations or foreign citizens. But migration flows, when you look at the definition, that's anybody who's changing their country of residence. So that means it includes both foreigners or foreign-born and native-born and nationals who are changing their country of residence. And the migrant stock database that the UN holds excludes that important component, which is the nationals either returning home or leaving their country. But yes. The UN, so the question is, what is the UN migrant stock database? It's a combination, it's mostly place of a country of birth data, mostly. But some countries don't collect information on country of birth, they collect country of citizenship. And so there's I don't know what the percentage, say 20% of the countries, this just, don't quote me on that, that's just a rough guess, are not actually country of birth, but country of citizenship. But we're making the assumption that country of citizenship is equivalent to country of birth, which it isn't always. But I guess my big point there is not lined up with the UN's recommendations on how to measure international migration flows, which is an annual measurement of how many people are changing their country of residence, regardless of your country of birth, regardless of your citizenship status, regardless of whether you're documented or undocumented. It's anyone kind of changing the country of usual residence. Okay, so I had some really good. I was really proud of the work I did when I was working in England, working on European migration. More recently, I've changed my attention to the Asia Pacific region, which is closer to Australia, where I now live. And I thought, well, naively, maybe I can apply a similar type of method to estimate flows in the Asia Pacific region. And I guess I did, but the big difference between Europe and the Asia Pacific region is there's no data. There's no benchmarking. There's no good data, bad data. There's just no data on flows practically. Or the few countries that have it are small, kind of unique countries. So that was challenging, and I'll talk a little bit about that in this talk today. I'll talk about the conceptual framework. Another project I had, which is more at the national scale, is when I first came to Australia, I looked at studying how migrant populations have changed since going back to almost their change of they had a white Australia policy, which is where they got rid of the kind of ethnic discrimination in their migration policies. And we have all this data, census data on stocks, births, deaths, and all this was by country of birth. And so we tracked 18 different migrant populations and all their demographic components of change across geographic areas from 1981 to 2021. And part of the project was to try to make the data consistent, because when you put all the numbers together in this demographic accounting equation, they don't line up. So we developed some methods to make it line. And then we had other problems like the geographic areas changed over time and so on. But that was a really interesting study because it allowed us to look at how migration is affecting population change. You know, things like in Sydney, over that period of time, 60% of births were due to migrants. Okay. In Brisbane, most of its population growth came from internal migration from elsewhere in the country. And so you could see that, and we looked at if you were a migrant going to a particular area, how likely were you to stay there? And if you weren't going to stay there, would you migrate out of the country or would you migrate somewhere else within the country? So we were able to, and that was a really fun project. And that's more at a local scale. And the last one, which is, this isn't really a major project, it's just kind of happened over time, but I've done some work on forecasting internal and international migration. Okay, so that's a bit of background. I don't have a watch here. Okay, please tell me when I start, I can speed things up or cut things out. I have two illustrations I'd like to go through. One is just to talk a little bit more about the Asia Pacific project that I had, which was estimating flows, annual flows by origin, destination, age, and sex. And this was funded by the Australian Research Council. And then more recently, I'm heading to New York next month to kind of see how this project's going. But I had a small project commissioned by the United Nations Population Division, which was just to well, they were asking me, what should the age and sex profile of a net migration be? And I know you guys some of you here are working on that right now for Washington. And that was an intriguing problem because my first response is, well, there is no such thing. You can't model it, but I got intrigued and so I don't actually model the net migration, but I'll show you what I do and try to explain that. Okay. And please stop me if you have questions or we're going too fast. So modeling migration in the Asia Pacific region, this was a project where we estimate annual flows from 2000 to 2019, right before COVID, just by chance. Actually, it was designed more on the data, not by that. So yeah, it misses out on the whole COVID effect. We defined Asia Pacific as 53 countries located in East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Oceania, and Pacific Islands, Canada, and the United States. And to make the kind of system complete, we added these 4 world regions so that we could actually cover the whole world. So we have rest of Asia, Europe, South and Central America, and Africa. And the challenges with this project, which when I wrote the grant proposal, I didn't realize how big they were, but they were immense, is that we really have no reliable flow data for Asia Pacific countries. There's quite a bit of foreign workers data, and there's bits and pieces from like International Labor Organization, but how do you use it is unclear because it's not always clear how it's measured. It often doesn't include nationals. It might include flows in one direction, but not the other. And out of these 53 countries, we really only had 3 countries that had data that we could use. And that was Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea. The rest, and the big countries like India and China, which we knew were dominating the migration patterns, no data. Do have some stock data, and we use some of that information. The other thing that was challenging, and especially coming from a European context, was the kind of heterogeneity within this region was immense. You had countries of like thousands in the Pacific Islands to over 1 billion in China and India. And so how do we think about that? How do we think about the migration patterns in these different systems? And some of those, especially those Pacific Island countries, are very isolated, and others were kind of in the middle of things. Not to mention, there's some political challenges. North Korea, South Korea, Pakistan, India. Our normal models would suggest that there would be large migration between those countries, but the political environment suggests otherwise. That said, so one option could be to not even try, which has been largely the experience with international migration. No data, let's not worry about it. But I would argue that something is better than nothing, or at least starting this process is worthwhile. The Asia Pacific region contains over 3/5 of the world's population. International migration is going to be increasing and thriving. And there's lots of academic articles on this, but we don't have any of the numbers to benchmark its relative importance. It's also different from other places in the world. Immigration is characterized by strict control of foreign workers, especially low-skilled foreign workers, prohibition of settlement and family reunion, denial of worker rights. So it's not the same type of migration you see in other places. And there's large numbers of undocumented, but that's hard to measure in any situation. There has been some assessment on the data situation in the Asia Pacific region. The reason why we don't have good data is due to weaknesses in just administrative registrations of foreign workers, trying to get a sense of the unauthorized migration. In some countries like Malaysia, some groups are heavily regulated, and then others, like say migrants from Indonesia, who they share a border with, there's kind of a free movement across the border. So there's a mixture of stuff happening. Measurement of return migration from a policy perspective, many countries don't care so much about return migration. remember talking to the person responsible for migration statistics in India, and international migration, while it's a big concern for the rest of the world, for India, it's small numbers compared to internal migration. So their priority is right now trying to understand internal migration. International migration is not a priority in terms of data collection. Making it, or even if they have the data or they have the means to collect the data, they don't make it publicly available, either because it's costly, it's difficult, they're not considered reliable, or it's politically sensitive. And the last thing is there are all sorts of issues with migration statistics in terms of institutional cooperation. This could be cooperation across countries, but also within countries. You might have your Department of Labor who doesn't communicate with your Department of Refugees or your Department of Education, whoever's gathering the data. Okay, so what do we do? So we had this situation where we had no data to benchmark our estimates off of. And so what we did is we came up with a kind of a building, what I like to call a building block system, where we built up the estimates. It's hierarchical. So if we get one of these early steps wrong, then it spills over to the rest. But this is what we did is we first modeled, it's generation distribution. What that means is you generate the out migrants and then you distribute them across destinations. Some people might call this a migrant pool model. This models have been around. But really what we did is we modeled the emigration rates from each country because we could link those to population at risk and characteristics in those countries. The trick, we can talk about the details. There are papers behind all this stuff, but the trick is, well, how do you know what the rate is? Well, we took some of the relationships that we found in European migration, which is where most of the migration data are, standardized that data and hoped that the relationships, we knew the effects of the covariates were different than the general relationships, that is, people move short distances for economic reasons and other things held. And so we came up with some estimates of immigration rates. That allowed us to come up with some estimates of immigration flows, which we then proportioned out to all possible destinations across these 53 countries and world regions. And here, the only real information we had on the distribution of migrants were that migrant stock data that we had. Again, it was about foreign born and foreign citizens, but we thought that was a good indicator. And the other thing that we used was trade flows as a way to say there's communication between countries in terms of trade. So we used a combination of those two to distribute the migrants. That's that second box, middle upper box. And then the combination of our generation distribution model gave us kind of flow estimates across countries. And the bottom row is all about kind of tweaks or estimates. So our initial set of estimates didn't give us migration from the rest of world countries. So we had to come up with a way to do that. The other thing is once we got our kind of initial set of estimates, there were things that didn't line up. Like I'm talking to Adrian and others here about, I believe beforehand, my expectation is there's a high correlation between inflows and outflows. Okay, that you always have this kind of, and that persists across internal migration, international migration. So when we found our initial estimates, our correlations were like 40 or 50%. And I was expecting something more along the 80 or 90%, especially in the margins of these tables. So what we did is we combined our initial estimates with a analogous table that had perfect correlation. And that allowed us to build in some correlation structure. And so we did things like that. In the last stage, we had to do some small tweaks. We replaced some of the estimates, like for South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, with the actual observed data. We had a couple of countries, specific islands, maybe Hong Kong, where we got really high levels of either, we got some unrealistic results where say 10% of the population was changing, So we did some minor tweaks. That didn't affect the overall estimates. It's just a final check and tweak. We just took, I think we just took the average of the two as and to calculate the proportions. No. Well, there's empirical, I mean, both have been used to estimate migration flows. I guess the question is, which is better than the other? And I think even for the stocks, you get, I mean, for the trade, you get different patterns depending on if you're looking on receiving versus sending. I remember we played around with all sorts of things. I forgot why we settled. I think we just went for the quick fix. The absence of information. Yeah. So it kind of gave us kind of an average of what we expect. I mean, stocks weren't, the problem with stock data is you don't get the return flows. Problem with trade flows is they're not people moving. So there's, both are imperfect.
Because of the mic situation.
Oh, sorry.
People online didn't hear anything.
Okay, so Adrian's question was, how did I choose between, for distributing the flows, migrant stock data or trade flows? And I believe what we did, if I remember right, we just took a simple average of the two kind of flow tables that we got as a kind of naive assumption saying we don't really know which is better. And I would say that's probably the worst thing about this whole project that always made me feel uncomfortable. There's really a lot of these kind of decisions that were important. And at some point we just had to go, okay, let's just work with this and move on to the next stage. Because we kept going and we kept getting in these circles to try something else. And we have a whole validation paper we're trying to publish now, but how do you validate these estimates when you don't have anything to validate them against? So we came up with a strategy for that, which was a mixture of, well, like looking at the migration rates. If you have 10% of the population changing every year, is that realistic? Whereas my expectation is more like 0.5% or something. But some of these small countries might have very large change. We did look at things like, if like sending versus receiving countries, you expect certain countries with better economic conditions to receive more migrants than they send. And so was our estimates matching up with that thinking? But that was a challenge. Yeah, that's an assumption too. Yeah, exactly. A lot of these, combining your theoretical expectations of migration into a modeling framework, where you're also trying to use whatever available data that you can get your hands on to inform that thinking. Yeah, so this is, but how do I say it? So I was able to publish these papers. I was worried actually when I started sending them off. Oh, there's a lot of steps in this. This is the age sex patterns, similar type of idea where we built up the age sex patterns over iterations. But when I started doing the European migration, no one had done that before. And my initial approach is to modeling European migration in the absence of any fixed thing was similar. At first they were saying it's too difficult, too hard, you can't do it. But now that's come a long way. So I see this as kind of the first stab at the problem. And I fully expect improvements to be made. Okay, so going back, so what we did for our strategy for Asia Pacific migrations, we first estimated the total flows from each country to all the other countries in the system. So we got these matrices, these tables of migration from origin by destination over time that we modeled. And the second step was to disaggregate those flows by age and sex. Because our ultimate goal, and this is, I guess this comes from me thinking like a demographer, that total flows are not enough. You need to have age and sex for your population models. Okay, and so that was written into it. So for that, that's what this next one is, kind of the second major stage where we just aggregate, we assume those total flows that we estimated are true and exact, and then we proportion those out by age and sex. And in a way that where we can get differentiation, different shapes.
The red is, so the blue and red are class.
I think those are just stylized because you can see they're all the same in the three. So in our first step, there is a blue and red in that stage one, top left, but they're very close. So we have male and female in that one. So we estimated age sex profiles, but we assumed all flows, our model said all flows have the same shape by age and sex. But there's a small difference between the age and sex profile. The second stage, we start incorporating some data. So here we actually use some migrant stock data by age from the receiving countries. So this is a destination age sex model. And here, the red line and blue line, I think, is more representative of, we had to split it up into foreigner and national. Okay, and for the foreigner, we could use that stock data. And we used the change in the age-specific stocks to inform their shapes. Okay? So that gave us a set. We still have a full matrix of flows by origin, destination, age, sex, but we're trying to refine those age sex patterns to be more realistic based on the available information we can get. So we do have some information on the destination age sex models, but unfortunately it's mostly about foreigners. Third stage is we brought in some origin sex, no age, but we brought in differences in sending countries' propensities to send, some countries send more males, some countries send more females. Again, we got this from the stock, or we got it from Guy Abel's stock, a flow from stock estimates. So we just, so we allowed for countries to have different levels of migration by sex. We had to dampen that because some of those estimates were, you have 100% of migrants from a country being either all male or all female. We didn't believe that. And then the last one, I can't remember what we did in the last one, but we did some final adjustments or something. That was the idea. Is we were only, but we never had any information on origin, age, sex, or we didn't have the full origin, destination, age, sex patterns. So we're building these models up to include more detail. I'm not going to talk about, but this is kind of a log linear modeling type framework. I've done a lot for internal migration where you have these categories. We couldn't. We were hoping we could, but what we did is we took his estimates and dampened them with an assumption that males and females had equal probabilities of moving. So we basically moved it towards a 50% line because he had some extremes in his estimates. Sorry, I'm not. Sorry. Yeah. So the question was, for the bringing in the sex information from these estimates that were produced by Guy Abel, did we adjust them? And the question was yes. And we kind of moved his estimates towards, or combined them with an assumption that male and female patterns were equal as a way to dampen the estimates. So and the result is we get a full over time set of estimates by age and sex for these 53 countries, or 53 by 53 countries of estimates. And these are just some of the examples that are showing up. And this is just for immigration and emigration. So immigration is the green line, and emigration is the red line. We did include some uncertainty. It's not Bayesian uncertainty. I would probably say the uncertainty is underestimated, but we tried to get some probabilistic information in there to give a sense of which estimates we believe more than others. So like Australia, for example, we had good data. So you see that the estimates are pretty close to the observed data. Australia, flows coming in are greater than those coming out. That's what we would expect. China, we see the opposite, but there's more uncertainty. More migrants are leaving than coming in. And I guess the nice thing is we get these age profiles that we would expect with migration. You see Thailand. Is that Thailand? Yeah, Thailand on the bottom right has a very different shape of people coming in than leaving. A lot younger. So that was another nice feature of this modeling. That we weren't, like I could just assume an age pattern for all the migration flows, but we were trying to use that stock information to get some variability in our age patterns. So in terms of achievements for this project, we have had a go at it. We've built a framework for indirectly estimating flows of migration in the near absence of reported data. It's quite mechanistic. It's quite step by step by step. So it's not what I call fully model based, but it's a starting point. I like to think of it as. More importantly, we now have a set of estimates that we can use as a means of inquiry for public discourse. So you can look at the estimates and you can say, I don't expect all the estimates to be 100% true or 50% true or whatever it is, but we can now have a number to say, well, this doesn't make sense or this makes perfect sense. And what I'm hoping to do someday, although it's really hard to organize, it'd be great to sit down with national statistical offices or people who are experts in the field and say, how do these, not only the levels look to you, but how do the patterns look? Are we missing something here? Yes, question in the back.
Just to clarify, the statistical model.
Immigration, like people coming into a country?
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't, so the question is, are immigration rates modeled using the generation distribution model? And the answer is no, because we only model the emigration, the outflows as a rate, because we have a population at risk, but we get our immigration through that distribution component. So with these flow tables, if you go across the rows, those are the outflows. If you go down the columns, those are the inflows. And that's part of the reason why I like these origin destination tables, is because you get that internal consistency, like an outflow. You have to, if you think about out migration from a country, they have to go. It's not just how many people are leaving, it's how many people are leaving and where are they going. And it's got to line up to where, so you get these checks with your tables that you don't get if you just model the ins and outs by themselves. Well, I guess, yeah, the question was, could I validate these estimates using European data? I think the answer is no. If I'd done all countries in the world, yes, probably. But presumably then you would also use European data as your main input. So it becomes hard to. Oh, I haven't thought of that. Sorry, okay. So to repeat, is the saying, pretend, so could I use this method to model European migration flows where we know some answers, or at least we have some harmonized estimates, and see how well it would work, assuming that we had no flow data? That's an excellent suggestion. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, actually. Thank you. All right, moving on. Okay, so that's the thing with modeling migration. So it gives you something, by having a set of estimates, as imperfect or as perfect as they are, they give you something from which to have a conversation. Because before this, you don't have any conversations. You just say, I don't know. The model can be improved. I have no doubts about that, but it's a starting point. Okay, how am I doing on time? I'm about out of time, aren't I? 5 minutes. Okay, so I'll talk very quickly about a small project that's been a lot of fun on looking at the age, sex profiles of net international migration. This was work that was commissioned by the United Nations Population Division to support its kind of world population prospects work. It's for all countries in the world. They were struggling with, I mean, as many of you know, they've made a huge advancements in their world population projection, prospects estimates, and in their projections. Everything's single year of age, probabilistic. I mean, they've just gone so much better than it used to be. But they were still struggling with the how to distribute net international migration. They had the totals, which they're more or less happy with, but and they had some specific problems related, especially to the oil-producing countries. So what they would have is their previous methodology would be if net migration was positive, they would assume all migration across age was positive. If it was negative, all migration by age was negative. So, and they used what's called the model migration schedule or Rogers-Castro curve to distribute those flows. That caused problems, especially when I think about these oil-producing countries, which has 80, 90% of its population are migrants. They've got huge temporary flows coming and going. But more importantly, those migrants coming in are not expected or are not allowed to stay. They can't age into the population. They have to leave. Okay, so if under their existing model, but they could have a year where there's positive net migration, and if they assumed all ages were positive, then they would, in their demographic accounting or projection models, they would age. And so this was causing some problems. So that was one thing. And other countries with large temporary flows. So as I told you early on, my first conversation is, well, don't model the net migration. But I thought, well, maybe you could, because there have been some people who have looked at age profiles. But then when I dug into it, actually, they developed those net age sex profiles off of flows. Anyway, I'll talk about it in a second. So, but generally speaking, and under this work, they need a simple method that can be applied to all countries in the world. It can be standardized, transparent, and that kind of stuff. So that was another kind of interesting challenge. You couldn't have a specific model for each country that you were thinking about. You needed a general model that could use minimal information. And ideally, well, we would have data and you would just subtract emigration from immigration to get your net migration. In practice, most countries don't have this data, so they use the demographic accounting equation to infer what net migration is. That's one of the reasons why it's so popular. So that is, you take a population at time t plus 1 minus the population at time t plus minus the births plus the deaths, and the result of that is your net migration estimate. This assumes that your population, birth, and death data are accurate and complete, but the big problem is it's not, right? Whatever errors there are in the births, deaths, or populations gets absorbed into this net migration estimate. That's one of the fundamental problems. And this gets compounded when you look at age and sex. So they actually showed me some of their kind of net age profiles they got from this residual estimation. And you'd get this huge heaping like in 0 to 1 year olds. Or you'd have these strange patterns that you knew were tied not to migration, but they were due to other things. So that was something. The other thing coming out from my perspective, always looking at flows, one thing we do know is there's huge regularities in our age patterns of migration flows. Most people migrate when they're young adults. Very few people migrate when they're elderly. Children can migrate a lot if their parents are migrating, or not if their parents don't bring them. So, I mean, there are these kind of things, and these age profiles of migration, which I'll show a couple in a second, you find them the same shape across internal migration, international migration. So it made sense to me to focus more on the flows and use that strength to then infer net migration. Whereas net migration, the more I dug into it and the more I looked at empirical data, we just couldn't figure out what a theoretical age profile should be for a particular specific country. And this is just to show you an example of how net migration can change by age for different situations. So the red line on top is immigration. The blue line curve is emigration, and the green line is your net migration. So on the top left, if immigration and emigration are the same across ages, your net migration is 0 and flat. The second one is if immigration is higher at all ages equally than emigration, then you get, again, a flat line, but it's above 0. If you have higher child immigration, but everything else is held equal, you get that little curve at the beginning, and so on. And you can flip it. You can say some situations have higher emigration. The bottom right says, what if you have migration levels about the same, but immigration is younger than emigration? What would your net age profile look like? And it has this kind of, what you call it, S shape type, where it's up and down curve. So you can see how much a net age profile can vary. But also notice that the overall shapes for the immigration and emigration don't change a whole lot. It's just a matter of kind of making slight tweaks to them. I'm sorry, I'm out of time, but what do you want? Keep going?
No, I was just.
Okay. So the procedure that we settled on was, well, first, one, I guess the trick to all of this is I have a net migration total that was given to me that I can assume is true and exact, and I can use that as a means for estimation. So I didn't have to worry actually about the net migration total. I just had, I could use, that was one thing. So I was really just focusing on the age and sex profiles of immigration and emigration, and then I could take the difference in those to get my net age sex pattern. The model is a very simple model in my view, where we were ultimately interested in this net age sex pattern of migration that in hat XY, but it's equal to, basically on the left is immigration by age and sex minus emigration by age and sex. But in terms of a model, what I'm doing is I'm breaking that up into 3 pieces on each side. I'm first going to model the overall level of immigration. I'm then going to model the kind of age sex profile of migration, and then I'm going to model proportion by sex. And when I multiply those 3 things together, I get my overall age sex profile with immigration, and same thing for emigration. The trick here, this is where that net migration total comes in handy, is, well, how do we get the levels of immigration or emigration? And what I came up with is, well, actually it doesn't, I can come up with an M, which is a rate of migration, both immigration and emigration. It's the same, either direction. And by looking at a lot of like European data, I had this figure in my head. It's not very scientific, but I know it's based on empirical. I'm sure I could justify it. But I had this notion that migration was about 0.5%, international migration, 0.5% in any given year. That's kind of my expectation as a starting point. And so I plugged that and I said, well, what if I assume that 0.5% of the population comes in to the population, half the population leaves in a given year, and then I adjust it based on this net migration total. You know, what would that look like? And it worked really well. Actually, what turns out, it doesn't really matter if it's 0.5% or 1% or 1/3%. I guess it does matter if you go to maybe 2% or something, but there's like a range, which I put in here, about 0.3 to 1.5%, 0.003 to 1.5%, that actually, because you're constrained to that net migration total, it's quite robust. All you need really is for your flows to be bigger than your net. This did fall apart when we looked at the GCC countries because the net was bigger than the flows, so we had to adjust our rate. But that was one trick, is just to come up with a rough estimate of what we think the flow might look like, and we made that proportional to a country's population size. Okay, and then the rest was just about proportioning out. And again, we used for our sex patterns, we used Guy Abel's estimates. working towards that dampened towards where we assume 50-50 split between males and females. And the harder part was thinking about the age sex profiles of immigration and emigration. So we actually needed 4 age profiles. Now I'm gonna we tested with empirical data using average rates, but we kept everything fixed over time for Sweden and South Korea. Here's just an example of what the age sex profiles look like for Sweden. Notice that males and females are pretty much the same. You see more differences in the emigration. Females tend to be, this is a single year of age, but they tend to be a little bit younger than males when they migrate, at least on the left side of that peak, the labor force peak. On the right side, seems to be more males. Korea had a slightly very different shape, actually, much more kind of really focused in those young adult years. Again, females, which is the red line, is a lot sharper, younger than the male pattern. And what was amazing to me, and I was surprised it turned out well, is we used that equation I gave you. We plugged in these average rates. They were empirical, but just used average rates over time, same age profile, same age sex profile, same M, everything was the same, but over this, whatever it was, 12 years, 15 years. And these are comparisons between the estimated age sex net migration and the observed pattern. So the estimated is blue and the red is the estimated. You can see it's really close. I was surprised how close. And it even captures some of these weird things like this little bump for males, which was, well, I know it's from unaccompanied minors seeking asylum. They tend to be male. You don't see that for females. And for Korea, it wasn't quite as lined up as well as Sweden, but still very close. So it was way better than I expected. Where the blue is the estimated and observed. So I guess I'm going to stop here for questions, but we were encouraged by this. We then expanded it to apply to all countries in the world. We didn't have empirical data, so we used model schedules where we had to make decisions on whether we expect immigration to be younger than emigration or vice versa. And now we're in the stage of, well, I'm going to go visit them. They're applying it, and we're going to see how well it matches up with the world population prospects. I'm excited by that. I'm going to stop. I'm sorry for running over. Yes.
Thank you for this presentation. I guess I'm not a quantitative scholar, so this is I don't know, a really easy question that everyone knows the answer to, but I'm curious about two things. So starting with the point that its countries are measuring who's coming in, not who's exiting, I was curious about how time plays into your calculations. So I was thinking essentially in 2015, 2016, all of these countries in Europe were measuring large numbers of people coming in, but and people were moving from one destination to another. So essentially we have an inflated number of people coming into countries for that reason. I'm curious how, when they report the data of when people come in, shapes your analysis, and then the fact that oftentimes people aren't going just from country A to country B, but instead going to multiple countries. How does that end up playing into these estimates?
Okay, so the question was about how do we incorporate time into these models?
Time
and multiple destinations into the models. So the way they're brought in is through the covariate information we're using to predict the pattern. So if, for example, population is used as a covariate to predict, well, that wouldn't be true. If, say, let me think of a time varying covariate, I have to think about what we used. I think we used a lot of the world population process, well, their indicators they use on things, but a lot of our covariates that we're using to predict the migration flows were changing over time. Others weren't. So like geographic location or its proximity to another country, that's fixed. But maybe the economic well-being indicator that we used is varying over time. So if that increased, you might expect migration to increase or decrease correspondingly. So that's the way time is brought in, is through the covariate. Same thing with the distribution. The stock data is only available every 5 years. So they're kind of averaged between the periods, but the trade flows are annual. So if those are exhibiting changes, they would influence the destination choices. So it's only because we have no data. So we don't have anything in the data that suggests that migration to these areas has increased. All we can do is look at the proximate kind of determinants that we're using to inform the estimates. And if that's varying over time, that contributes to that. We also look for, they tend to be probably smoothed out. We don't get many, as a consequence, we don't get many jagged ups and downs and stuff that you may see in real data in some situations. Okay, go ahead, Adrian.
So, like to start off with reading differentiation and migration. And then as your career runs to the end, at the end, you're to full on.
Yeah.
So would you like to maybe improve your initial statement?
No, I stand by what I said. Don't model net migration. But yeah, but in a practical situation, sometimes you're in a situation where the user, the client, or whatever you want to call them, only wants net migration. And I guess the way I deal with that is, one is, well, I still think I'll give the user what they want in terms of their inputs for their projection models. That's fine. But what's going underlying those estimates are something that's more theoretically based. So I'm modeling the flows and then taking the differences. I'm also like to think I'm trying to corrupt them a bit by saying, well, you should really be modeling the matrix of flows and, you know, these type of things. So I think I always, yeah, you have to start somewhere. You have to be pragmatic at times. But I have this goal, I guess, in the end, where you think at the end of the day, ultimately what we really want is this big origin destination tables that are now coming out. I mean, you've worked on that. That's what we really need to understand migration, not net or even immigration, emigration. But I guess the pragmatic thing here is, well, it made my life easier by not having to worry about it in some ways. I just, they gave it to me. I don't have to say, do I believe it or not? I just say, okay, that's what it is. So that was, if I didn't have that net, that's a bigger question. So they were not interested in me looking at the net migration estimates. They said, we're happy with those. And so in some ways that made my life easier. I just could focus on the age sex distributions. I don't know what I would have done if they said model the net totals, because I think that would be a different problem.
I'd love to have information. Share the future. You're right for a social science situation, but it's a question of international organizations and there are some places that are very interested in that. Some places are not. Not because of the value. So then follow on it's not account. So I was wondering if you could answer a sense of that, especially where people want to
So the question was, how interested, correct me if I'm wrong, but how interested are countries, even international organizations, on estimates of emigration, people leaving, versus immigration? And well, the reality is countries are really only interested in controlling flows of foreigners. That's the legal aspect of it. That's where you get the best data. So they're not that interested in returning nationals. I don't even think they care where they were beforehand, or who's leaving. Well, they are, but they don't put data systems behind it. And that's, yeah, and well, taxes, yes, to some extent. The US isn't interested because they forced Australian banks to disclose my financial information, that type of stuff. So they do work with their expats, but I'm trying to think. Yeah, so I think the reality is most people are focused on entry and security, border control, and citizens coming back or citizens leaving is not a security concern. So if you think about that, the increasing link between security and migration, then yeah, immigration doesn't matter so much. The other thing is immigration is really hard to measure from a statistical perspective, because someone has to, so when someone leaves the country, they have to tell the authorities that they're not going to come back, or they have to have some kind of population register that keeps track of things. And many countries don't have that. On the other hand, countries that do have estimates of both immigration and emigration, what you find is it's much easier to predict emigration, people leaving, than people coming in, because you have that population. So from a demographic perspective, that emigration is much easier to predict than the immigration, because you know who's in the population, you know how many foreigners you have, you know their ages, their sexes, potentially what their occupations are, what visa categories are on. So yeah, it's a challenge. And why, I guess the other question is, why would a country care where its citizens are? Well, human rights perspective, potentially, but countries probably don't care about that. So yeah, maybe it is mostly academic if we think about policymakers' perspective, individual country. Yeah. Yep. And they don't know where their overseas citizens are, because all they do at the passport control is look at your citizenship. So they know so many Australians are leaving each year, and it's about 20-30% of the population leaves each year. 20-30% of the migrants. It's a huge proportion, but and they'll get 80 or 90% coming back over time, but they don't have any information on where they go to or where they're coming from.
Thank you. Thank you, James.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks for coming.